This week, our lecture and topic is called Space, Words and Everything. What we're going to do this week, first of all, I'm just going to recap and go through the Tower of Babylon exercise that I introduced last week. So hopefully by now everybody has watched the tutorial and hopefully gotten through the skills that I introduced in the tutorial and taken some screenshots and any other drawings that you think kind of help express your thoughts and upload them to the Moodle section before class. Because in class I'd like to download everything that you guys have put up there and go through some of the drawings and screenshots as well as some of the 3D models of the ziggurats that I asked you to make. And if there's a really great one there, I'll agree to 3D print it for you when we get back on campus. Okay, and then we're going to shift over to focusing on the topic of this week's class, which is this lecture. So I'd like you to watch this lecture before class. The lecture is called Space, Words and Everything. And then we're going to have a student-led discussion of Jorge Borges's short story, The Library of Babel. And then at the end of class, I'm going to introduce our second 3D modeling task, which is going to be another procedural modeling exercise, this time 3D modeling the Library of Babel, which is basically the exercise is the image that's on this slide. Okay, so from last week, I asked you to model the Tower of Babylon as represented by Ted Chiang in his short story, Tower of Babylon. So I've uploaded a tutorial in Blender that asks you to model a Tower of Babylon using arrays and empties, starting with basic forms, and remember, don't be afraid to delete things and start again rather than fix up one little mess and make another big mess somewhere else. It's always okay to delete a simple shape and start again. And any screenshots you have of things you thought went really well, or also problems that you had, feel free to upload all of these to Moodle as well as any other conceptual sketches that you have. Okay, so I really look forward to having a look at what you uploaded and any interesting approaches you had for how to visualize something that really is quite difficult to visualize. We discussed last week all sorts of different ways that when we all read the same text, we imagined spatially different ways of how this world that Ted Chiang is describing might actually fit together. So this week, I've called the lecture Space, Words and Everything. And we're looking at another short story that's also based on the Tower of Babylon myth, but also another story that can be used to explore some really core concepts in 3D graphics and 3D modeling. So in this class, I'm going to introduce the writer, Jorge Luis Borges, and some of the ideas that have repeated throughout his work and how these ideas have also influenced other works of art and culture. The reason that I'm focusing on these type of short stories that are based around iteration and repetition is that iteration and repetition are really quite important concepts that make 3D modeling such a powerful expressive tool. In a way, there's a mathematical structure to the way that Borges writes that I think connects very well with the mathematical structure of 3D modeling and animation. So of course we'll get on to all sorts of different ways of animating and lighting a scene to make it look atmospheric and beautiful, but really I want to start with some of these really powerful ways that we can use mathematical concepts to make quite complex things in 3D graphics quite easily and quite efficiently. Okay, so many of the ideas that I'm going to use in this lecture and the quotes that I deliver all come from the introduction to the book Jorge Luis Borges on Mysticism, and this introduction was written by Maria Kodama in 2010. Borges was a philosopher and a writer from Argentina who is most famous for the short story collections he published in the 1940s. So here are some excerpts from his writing, just to give you an idea. In the 1950s, 1950 story The Maker, Borges writes, "A man sets out to draw the world. As the years go by, he peoples a space with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, fish, rooms, instruments, starts, horses, and individuals. A short time before he dies, he discovers that the patient labyrinth of lines traces the lineaments of his own face." Let's move on to another quote. In the 1949 story The Aleph, Borges writes, "I saw the Aleph from everywhere at once, saw the earth in the Aleph, saw my face and my viscera, saw your face, and I felt dizzy, and I wept, because my eyes had seen that secret hypothetical object whose name has been usurped by men, but which no man has ever truly looked upon, the inconceivable universe." In the Aleph, Borges is trying to describe what some people might call a high-dimensional spatial singularity, a tiny sphere that contains the entire universe but is visible from every single angle all at once. In both of these quotes that we've just looked at, we can see that Borges has this fascination with the overlapping of the infinite and the finite. Or to put this in another way, a fascination with travelling a great distance only to arrive at the exact same place from where you started. And this particular type of spatial recursion was a theme that we also discussed last week in reference to Ted Chiang, but it's also a very common feature in many computer games, where, for example, exiting the left-hand border of a game results in the player entering from the right-hand border of the game. The similarity, actually, between the spatial imagination of Borges and early computer games is explored brilliantly in this lecture by Professor Marcus de Sautoy in his lecture given at Gresham College in 2015, which you can watch yourself in the YouTube link below. Sautoy explains that if we have a two-dimensional world, such as that of a top-down computer game like Asteroids, this world can be made infinite by wrapping it onto a three-dimensional torus or a donut shape. The result being that the left and right axis are connected together and the up and down axis are connected together, giving the experience of the infinite two-dimensional space that we have in a game like Asteroids, where we go out one side and appear in the other, but allowing us to conceptualize how this universe is shaped by wrapping the two-dimensional world around a three-dimensional world. And this kind of move of expressing infinity using space, I think, is something that Borges is looking at in a lot of his stories. The idea of a universe that is visible all at once from every angle in one tiny point. Or in the case of the library, an endless library where, as it says late in the story, if someone walks forever, they might end up in some version of where they began. So actually, the solution from the previous slide for converting the infinite world of Asteroids into a 3D shape is also the solution that I used in our Borges Blender task for this week. In that Blender video, I've demonstrated how to make a two-dimensional hexagonal sort of honeycomb-like structure, and then I've extruded it just to give it some depth to have some library chambers inside, and then I've done exactly what our mathematician friend suggested, which was to wrap this mesh around two different circles, giving it this sort of torus donut shape. But I mean, you'll see that this is only really a two-dimensional or maybe a 2.5-dimensional solution to Borges's library. As I understand it, a visualization of Borges's library in 3D graphics is probably, maybe not impossible, but very difficult for us to visualize, because he's talking almost about a 4-dimensional space rather than a 3-dimensional space, something that allows a particular type of recursive infinity that in 3-dimensional space is quite hard to achieve. But in the solution, as I said in this lecture, I've really just used a 2-dimensional vision of Borges's library, as in there's not infinite levels stacked on top of one another, just going out laterally, and then I've wrapped this sort of 2.5 dimensional space around the 3-dimensional torus. But again, the whole point of this was really to show how we can connect these concepts in literature to really fundamental ways that 3D modeling works, by using simple shapes and applying them against one another to create a high amount of complexity, but using the computer to do all the hard work. Okay, so let's move on to the text itself, the Library of Babel. And this story continues our investigation into the limits of human knowledge as expressed using the spatial imagination. Very much like Ted Chiang's Tower of Babylon story from last week, Borges draws from the Old Testament myth of the Tower of Babel in order to ask mathematical questions about the limits of human knowledge and the relationship between language, probability, and I would also say time. And the proposition of the Library of Babel is this: what if there was a library that comprised books made with every possible combination of letters and punctuation from the 25 characters of the Latin alphabet? For him, this was 22 letters, the period, the comma, and the space. Each book would be 410 pages, with 40 lines to each page. With this limitation, the library should contain every single book that could be written, as well as every single spelling error, every single book of complete nonsense, every single possible combination of the letters, lines, and page numbers. And every combination should give the number 25 to the power of 1,312,000 books. As Benjamin Bratton points out in the footnotes to the Stack on Software and Sovereignty in 2015, one authentic volume of this book would occupy the entire space of our known universe. So 25 to the power of 1,312,000 is an extraordinarily large number, but it's not an infinite number, it's a finite number because of these limitations that Borges has given. But okay, so if this library contains every book that could ever be written, as well as every other possible book with spelling mistakes and mistruths and just complete jumble of letters, the library would include your entire life story before it's even happened, as well as your entire life story that doesn't happen, everything that doesn't happen to you. The theme of this sort of infinite library was actually developed about 50 years before Borges wrote his short story by a German philosopher, Kurt Lasowitz, in his story from 1901 called The Universal Library. And in the short story, Borges describes his books arranged in hexagonal chambers, like a beehive, like the Blender exercise we're working on, in some sort of high-dimensional shape, something like a torus or a sphere that has its center everywhere and its circumference nowhere, this sort of impossibly sort of infinite yet recursive spatial dimension. And you'll recognize the idea of this type of shape from our discussion of Ted Chiang's cosmology last week. And you'll also recognize in Borges' story a similar investigation into the limits of human knowledge and experience expressed through an intellectual spatial exercise. The spatial, temporal, and linguistic implications of the Library of Babel have also been referenced many times in subsequent cultural works. For example, with the GIFs on this screen, in Christopher Nolan's film Interstellar, after passing through the event horizon of the black hole, our protagonist finds himself in an infinite library built out of what seem to be 4-dimensional tesseracts, which mirror the bookshelves of his family home, but also clearly reference the story of Borges' library. So, in her introduction to Jorge Luis Borges on mysticism, Kodama explores how Borges used a combination of mathematics, probability, philosophy, and religious studies in his own efforts to understand the totality of existence and in the pursuit of his own mystical experience. When connecting Borges' library to the title of the story, The Library of Babel, Kodama points once again to the book of Genesis, where she quotes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." According to Kodama, Borges interpreted word literally to mean everything, and experimented with this concept in the Library of Babel and how it reflected on our understanding of language, knowledge, and time. Kodama writes, Borges refers to the desperation he feels as a writer facing the impossibility of using words to describe the simultaneity that his eyes see, because the word is successive, because man is made of time, and that time is humanly successive. So let's think about this. We experience language through time, words in sequence, narratives in their chronological unfolding. But on the other hand, in the case of Borges's library, all texts can already exist in their potential form, even if no one has read them. If your entire life already exists somewhere in the Library of Babel, are you living your life as a result of the choices made by your own free will, or simply performing the acts that are described in a book that already exists somewhere in the shelves and stacks of the library? Using language as an escape route from time, Borges compares the experience of a text to the experience of being in the world. If the library exists as a finite number of books to be read, do all our lives exist simply as a finite number of experiences that can be had via possible combinations and interactions in the world? Now we can see why the question of time and experience is also implied by this notion of recombination and infinity that Borges explores. Let me just have a sip of tea for a second, sorry, throat's dry. Okay, so to show you what I mean, we can actually look up a book in Borges's library. Quite conveniently, the Library of Babel has actually been coded as a website and can be found at libraryofbabel.info. So type into the library exactly what you did today into the computer version of Borges's library, and you're going to find that everything you write in already exists somewhere on some page in some book, exactly as you typed it and exactly as you did it. Then type the next thought that comes into your head, and this page will exist too. It has a page number and a book number. Copy an article from the news. That article will be there too. So will tomorrow's news, but also tomorrow's not news, or tomorrow's news with one spelling mistake. So now you can see exactly what Kodama is talking about with Borges's particular obsession with this idea of the word as everything. To move on a little bit, the way that Borges used language itself, coupled with architecture in this short story as a subject and the medium for his philosophical inquiry, also parallels one of the most famous quotes in 20th century media studies. In his 1964 book, Understanding Media, Canadian philosopher Marshall McLuhan argued that the medium is the message, that the content of any medium is always another medium. Speech is in the content of writing. Writing is in the content of print, and print is in the content of the telegraph, and so on and so forth, which led Marshall to his most famous quote, "The medium is the message." In his subsequent book, The Medium is a Massage, with Quentin Flore, McLuhan and Flore write, "Until writing was invented, man lived in an acoustic space, boundless, directionless, horizonless, in the dark of the mind, in the world of emotion, by primordial intuition, by terror. Speech is a social chart of this bog. The goose quill put an end to talk. It abolished mystery. It gave architecture and towns. It brought roads and armies, bureaucracy. It was a basic metaphor with which the cycle of civilization began, the step from the dark into the light of the mind. The hand that filled the parchment page built a city." By connecting Borges's obsession with language and time, we can also, for us as visual artists, consider much broader questions. To what extent is every artwork already implied by the possible combinations of a medium? For Borges, the existence of every book is implied by the existence of language. Could we say that the existence of every single digital image is implied by the mathematical combination of random pixels? Once we have the RGB system of pixels, do we have essentially the meta-medium for every possible image that could already exist, much like the library? In his discussion of how contemporary culture is shaped by software, the artist and media theorist Lev Manovich makes a very Borges-like point when he writes, "A medium is not just a set of materials and tools, whether physical, mechanical, electronic, or implemented in software, and artistic techniques supported by these tools. It's also an imaginary database of all expressive possibilities, compositions, emotional states and dynamics, representational and communicational techniques, and content actualized in all the works created with a particular combination of certain materials and tools." Manovich continues, "As a result, the idea of a medium, in a sense that all creative works and possibilities realized so far using a set of technologies, has become quite real. As opposed to holding the imaginary database of key works in a particular medium in your head, which our head is not the most reliable place for such large-scale storage, you can now quickly consult the web and locate and study any of them." So, could we say that every image is therefore implied by Photoshop? This Borges-type approach to language can be applied over to any other language, in this case, the visual language and particularly the computer language of RGB pixels. Once we have an editing program like Photoshop, Manovich asks, to what extent does Photoshop or any similar software imply the existence of every single image that could be made using that program? To conclude, what we can take from Borges is a very computerized way of thinking about the potential of any creative language. And this is the reason that I'm starting our spatial practices with these sort of fantasy science fiction versions of the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. As we start to work with 3D modeling and animation, I want you to think about the computational nature of 3D modeling. As we progress, we will learn more about rendering animations, more detailed 3D modeling, and how we can mix these techniques with other media such as sound and video. But at this early point, I'm using these short stories to focus on the uniquely mathematical nature of computer graphics. Just as the library of Borges was simulated by a website, in Blender we can use arrays, recursion, and a wide number of what we call procedural approaches to explore philosophically fascinating and engaging ideas. Okay, so that's it for our lecture for this week. We're going to return now to the live chat where we will have a student-led discussion of the text, and I will also introduce our next exercise in Blender. Thanks a lot. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.